As the internet launched an age of fragmented playlists and fleeting attention spans, the concept album had all but disappeared. But then, in 2005, Saint Etienne, a trio of perennial chroniclers of British life in miniature, did something quietly radical. They resurrected it. Tales from the Turnpike House wasn't a rock opera or an overwrought narrative. Instead, it was subtle, suburban, singular, a day in the life of a fictional block of flats loosely based in reality somewhere just beyond London's central hum. It told stories softly, as if overheard through paper-thin council estate walls. Hi, I'm Andy Fenstermaker, host of Poetic Wax, a weekly music history series and podcast where I dig into the record collection I've been building since the 1990s and explore the sometimes little known or little told history of a band, album, or song from within. There's a real world inspiration behind Tales from the Turnpike House, a backdrop on how the album would sound, feel, and unfold. Turnpike House, the namesake, is a post-war residential block in Islington, North London, designed by the modernist architects Lubitkin and Tecton, and completed in the 1950s. It was part of a larger wave of council housing meant to embody a new era of civic optimism. Reinforced concrete, floor-to-ceiling windows, communal green space, these were meant to offer dignity to the working class, a utopia with a lift and a letterbox. But the Turnpike House of Saint Etienne's imagining isn't quite that building. As Sarah Cracknell clarified, it's not nearly as smart. The fictional Turnpike House is more anonymous, less architectural marvel, more municipal monolith. Not a showpiece, but a shell for lives unfolding, out of sight. Bob Stanley was more specific. Quote, "We were imagining somewhere in Croydon or possibly Ponder's End. These are liminal zones, outer boroughs and in-between spaces on the edge of London's map. They're where the city begins to blur into something more domestic, less performative. And that's where this album lives, not in concrete, but in context. The building, in this sense, becomes more than location. It's a frame, a structural metaphor for containment and connection. Each flat is a self-contained world, yet they stack upon one another like verses in a song. People live cheek to jowl, strangers by design, and in this there's a subtle melancholy, the irony that proximity doesn't always breed intimacy. This is where Tales from the Turnpike House finds its emotional center. The architecture of mid-century Britain wasn't literal concrete, it was ideological concrete. These council estates were born from a vision of community, order, and shared space. But by the 2000s, many had fallen into neglect or had been torn down altogether, victims of underfunding and urban indifference. Saint Etienne doesn't mythologize this decline. Instead, they capture the poetry within it, the humdrum humanity of shared stairwells, early morning radio through thin walls, the flicker of a television through drawn curtains. The building becomes a vessel for the stories housed within. It's telling that the album's sound mirrors the structure it imagines. Songs bleed into one another like adjacent flats sharing a wall. There's repetition, but also quiet variation. Pausing for a moment before we dig into the album for a bit of self-promotion. Poetic Wax can be found on YouTube, on TikTok, on your favorite podcast platforms, and on Substack. I'd love it if you followed me in multiple places. You can also join the weekly newsletter where I get a little bit more personal at poeticwaxpodcast.com/join. From Sun in My Morning, which opens like a curtain on domestic calm, to Milk Bottle Symphony with its name-dropping roll call of unseen neighbors, the album crafts vignettes with journalistic precision. Number 12, Amy Chan, Emily Rose at 31. These names are lives distilled into melody, and these melodies are where the magic deepens. To bring to life their imagined tenets, Saint Etienne enlisted Xenomania, the pop production house behind Girls Aloud and Sugar Babes. It was an unusual pairing. Xenomania's glossier instincts met Saint Etienne's understated elegance. The result, songs like Stars Above Us and Lightning Strikes Twice, tracks that glisten but never really glare, danceable yet diaristic. There's a lightness to this album that sets it apart from its immediate predecessor, Finisterre, which was darker and more documentary in tone. Pete Wiggs, Saint Etienne's keyboardist, said that after Finisterre they wanted something, quote, a bit lighter. This album is exactly that. Not lighter in content, but in temperature. It's warmer, closer. It's also unusually tender. Teenage Winter, one of the standout tracks, feels almost mournful in its observation. Cracknell sings of a time when pop culture was tactile, when you clipped smash hits and hoarded cassettes. There's melancholy here, yes, but it's affectionate. These are memories, not regrets. Perhaps the most unexpected turn in Tales from the Turnpike House is its companion, a children's album titled Up the Wooden Hills. It came bundled with the deluxe edition, narrated by none other than David Essex, the legendary glam rocker turned narrator of bedtime tales. This project was intended to reach both children and parents, a kind of musical bridging of generations. It was whimsical, odd, and honestly perfectly Saint Etienne. Tales peaked at number 72 in the UK. By no means high. But it did earn critical praise. Pitchfork called it a cozy dream world, and The Guardian called it a modern triumph. Saint Etienne has always been a cult favorite of the Eurodance crowd, and Tales from the Turnpike House is no different. It's a record that listeners return to when the world feels too fast, too loud, too unrooted. Times like right now, because at its core, this is an album about home. Not just the physical space, but the emotional coordinates we return to. Tales from the Turnpike House may have marked a quiet peak in Saint Etienne's narrative songwriting, but its themes of place and memory and domestic melancholy very certainly didn't end there. In the years that followed, the band would revisit this creative well, again and again. In 2012, they released Words and Music by Saint Etienne, an album that on its surface feels lighter and more radio-friendly, but beneath the polished production lies a familiar thread. Music as emotional geography mapped across space and time. Bob Stanley described the record as being about, quote, how music finds its way into your life, end quote. A theme not far removed from Tales, where music is life, wafting through Council Flat corridors. Then came Home Counties in 2017, an album that is named after the ring of commuter suburbs encircling London, Croydon, Ponders End, Woking, and their spiritual ilk. It's arguably their most direct return to the themes of Turnpike House, and it's a semi-concept album that charts the banality, charm, and contradictions of British suburbia. A lot of parallels there. Even I've Been Trying to Tell You from 2021, among their most abstract records along with their most recent one, it echoes this emotional palette of tales, built from samples of optimistic late 90s pop. It sounds like memory caught in fog, filtered through nostalgia and maybe a little regret. Though less rooted in location, it deals with the same currency, time, loss, the passing of cultural moments. It's Turnpike House, but turned inward. Across these works, Saint Etienne never returned to the same fictional block of flats, but they did continue to elevate the ordinary, to cast suburban stillness in cinematic light. Whether it's a tower block in Islington or a Tesco in Luton, they see the world not as it's mocked, but as it's lived, in fragments and routines, in soft, sad beauty. Tales from the Turnpike House was a love letter to a fading way of life, and its legacy extends beyond what it captured to what it quietly set in motion, the subsequent chapters. Though the album closes with Good Night, a lullaby fading into late-night quiet, Saint Etienne never truly left the corridors, the kitchens, or the commuter routes of their imagined Turnpike House. In the years that followed, they returned again and again to the themes embedded in its concrete: place, routine, memory, and the poetry of the peripheral. Looking back, Tales from the Turnpike House stretched beyond a mere concept album. It was a tonal and thematic foundation the band would keep building on, revisiting, and refining. It showed that concept albums didn't need to be grandiose or theatrical. They could be gentle, local, and human. And perhaps that's why this album resonates. Our world is obsessed with movement and escalation and spectacle. And Saint Etienne reminded us that stillness has a story, and that these stories matter. That the lives we pass in silence on buses, behind thin walls, in fluorescent lit offices, on the freeway, contain a whole universe of feeling and story and life. You just have to listen.